No,
thorough.
I'm saying I
We're
might
very
need 2 or 3
thorough.
days.
It has been really. Okay, we are back live in Senate Economic Development, and we have Damien to go through the next 3 sections of draft 5.1 of our omnibus housing bill, starting on page 20.
Great, thank you. For the record, Damien Leonard, Office of Legislative Counsel. Would you like me to share this on the screen, or would you prefer to just
We
read
have it.
along in your own drafts?
I think we all have it, right?
Yeah.
But for the public,
Or
They can
It's
look
up
at
to
it
you.
on.
they can
They
look.
can look,
on
it's
the
up- it's
screen.
posted.
Totally-
Okay.
Yeah, it's
Great,
stylistic, I guess, yeah.
yeah. Every committee has a different preference, so I always ask before I get started. We'll start in section 19, I believe.
So we're just skipping
Beyond
over
that.
ADU jurisdiction and coming back to that.
Right, so ADUs are
Not you.
outside
That is,
of,
we're into enforcement.
yes. Yes, so this is going to bring us into the Fair Housing and Public Accommodations Act, which is how we enforce housing discrimination. It's worth noting, before I go any deeper into this language, that the language we're about to go over applies to both public accommodations and the fair housing. So that's something to note. If you want to limit the application to just housing, we have to make a few tweaks to the language.
Okay.
What we're doing here is amending in section 19, 9 VSA 4506, which provides basically the enforcement of the Fair Housing and Public Accommodations Act. We're adding new language here at the bottom of the page on line 19 that provides that a charge of discrimination may be referred by the Human Rights Commission to the Attorney General or a state's attorney for either investigation and enforcement, or following an investigation by the commission for enforcement. So what this allows the Human Rights Commission to do is, in certain instances where they think it's appropriate, they can either ask the Attorney General, probably the Attorney General if we're talking investigation and enforcement, just because of the resources in that option, or following the Human Rights Commission's own investigation, if they don't have the resources to do the enforcement action, they could ask a state's attorney or the Attorney General to do it for them. So it basically adds resources to the Human Rights Commission right now. This is similar to some of the provisions we have around misclassification, where we allow, for example, the Department of Labor to refer instances of what it believes are systemic, potential systemic misclassification of employees to the Attorney General because of the greater resources there. The changes on page 23 are really just changes to align it with that new language, allowing the Attorney General or a state's attorney to investigate or enforce.
Oh,
And-
you're including state's attorneys here too?
We are, and that's modeled on the employment laws around discrimination, where under the Fair Employment Practices Act, both the state's attorneys and the Attorney General have jurisdiction under the law. As a practical matter, I think only the Attorney General typically takes those cases because the state's attorneys have limited resources and very full portfolio as well.
Yeah.
So with all of these, there's going to be a question of resources for all of these offices. So I imagine that will be a subject for committee testimony at some point. In section 20, at the bottom of page 23, we've moved into the next chapter of Title IX, which governs the Human Rights Commission. So we're amending 9 VSA 4554. Confusingly, this refers back to individuals who feel that they've been discriminated against under the Fair Housing and Public Accommodations Act. I apologize for that if it it creates confusion. The law has been that way for decades at this point. So we'll just work with it as it is. The changes on page 23 are just technical changes. As you've probably become very familiar with at this point, we're making the laws gender neutral. And
what's interesting is that this one has a nice other benefit that they don't have to believe they were
Yes.
subject to unlawful discrimination.
yeah, well, so
That seems like a good thing to remove too.
it, so the old language, what it implies is that they believe, but they might not have been.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's inconsistent with our other anti-discrimination
Right.
laws, which say an individual who's been subject to unlawful discrimination,
Yeah,
as a practical matter, there's going to be an investigation.
Right,
And you've
right.
got a burden of proof when you get to court or the Human
Mhm.
Rights Commission. So it takes the implication out
Mm-hmm.
of the law that perhaps these individuals are wrong and puts them on the same
Yeah.
footing as all of our other anti-discrimination laws. They still have the same burden of proof.
Mhm.
Yeah,
So-
that's great.
Yeah. On page 24, this gets into that burden of proof I was just mentioning. So if a complaint states a prima facie case, which basically means that you have to show that you belong to a protected class, that you suffered some sort of adverse or discriminatory treatment, or at least something that could be characterized that way, and that it can be traced to your protected class. It doesn't mean that you have to prove all of that yet. It just means that on the face of the allegation, it appears that you have a case at first glance, and then the investigation and factual development goes from there. So what this basically provides in two is that the complaint can be accepted for investigation by the commission, or if the complaint alleges a violation of the provisions of the Fair Housing and Public Accommodations Act by a person other than the state, because the Attorney General is also the defense attorney for the state, so that would create a conflict. The commission may, in its discretion, refer the complaint to either the Attorney General or a state's attorney for investigation and enforcement pursuant to subsection I of this section. So that the other than the state piece is really just preventing some sort of conflict of interest where you'd be asking the Attorney General to investigate the party that it would then be charged with defending in court, which is clearly problematic. But so this would basically allow them to refer complaints against any private actor or a municipality or any other political subdivision of the state that's not the state government itself. The next section here, we're doing corresponding changes, just to say if the commission does not refer the complaint to the AG or a state's attorney, it then lays out how the commission would carry out its investigation. And this is all existing law here. So I will skip over it unless the committee wants to dig into the Human Rights Commission's process, which brings us down to page 25, subsection E1 is again existing law if the commission finds reasonable grounds to believe that discrimination occurred. And then this next piece, E2, this gets to right now, the commission has 6 months to attempt to dispose of the case by informal means. So basically reach an informal resolution or settlement of the case. And then within that 6 months, if they are unable to reach an informal resolution, they also have to bring an action in Superior Court or take further actions that we'll go into below. What this does is it gives them 90 additional days after that 6 month period, so they can use the full 6 months to try for informal resolution. I saw a question from Senator Cummings.
Well,
it's not directly related to this, but I have a constituent who reached one of these agreements, housing discrimination resolution. She didn't think she got what she bargained for, went back, asked to be released from the agreement. And the Human Rights Commission said, no, this meets, it's, and was told there is no appeal from the Human Rights Commission decision. Now, you may not, I just can't believe we wrote something where there was no appeal to court.
So it's important to know what we're dealing with here is that's a settlement,
Yes,
which is at the end of the settlement, you agree to dismiss your case.
yes,
So it's a little bit different than if there is a decision by the commission and they choose to take that to court. So what the commission's options are at this point, if they can't reach a settlement,
well, this was a settlement,
right?
and one of the parties to the settlement, the apartment wasn't as big as the blueprint said it was, so came back, said, I want out of the settlement. It's not what I thought it was. And the Human Rights Commission declined to let her out of the agreement. And she said there was no appeal to that decision for her.
So I
Okay,
think
and
this is
you can
getting,
get back.
yeah, I think this is getting a little bit outside of
Yeah, it
this, and it gets into kind of a completely different issue
Okay,
of the law around enforcement of settlement agreements.
okay.
So probably better for us to have a conversation offline.
I thought maybe there might be some simple thing like, yes, there is an appeal, but. Okay.
Oh, what a nice idea.
Nothing separate.
Yeah.
I should think
So if the case isn't disposed of by informal means, meaning by a settlement, then the Human Rights Commission would have 90 days following that 6-month period to either bring an action in Superior Court to enforce the Fair Housing and Public Accommodations Act, to refer the case to the AG or a state's attorney to enforce the provisions of the Fair Housing and Public Accommodations Act, and importantly, to potentially pursue a fine, which we're going to talk about in a moment, or they could dismiss the proceedings. So sometimes what you may have is a case where there isn't a clear violation that occurred, but maybe there was some bad behavior that occurred. And so the Human Rights Commission seeks to still find a settlement to get the parties to move forward and to address things, even if there isn't a clear or strong case that unlawful conduct occurred. And I would defer to the commission for more discussion of how they make those decisions. But oftentimes they can help, an entity that allegedly discriminated, even if they don't have a clear showing that discrimination occurred, they can help them improve their practices if they can get them to enter into a settlement. And it can also help the individual who felt they were wronged to feel like they got some justice out of the situation. But if you don't have a strong case, it would be a waste of resources to bring the case in court at that point, so they could dismiss the proceedings. Subdivision 3 is really rewriting existing language that allows all parties to consent to an extension of the time limits to complete good faith negotiations around the settlement. And you'll see the old language struck out just above it on lines 4 through 6. Starting on line 11, new subsection I provides that the Attorney General or a state's attorney can enforce the provisions of the Fair Housing and Public Accommodations Act by restraining prohibited acts, seeking civil penalties, obtaining assurances of discontinuance, and conducting civil investigations in accordance with the Consumer Protection Act, as though unlawful discrimination in violation of the Fair Housing and Public Accommodations Act were an unfair act in commerce. This mirrors the language we have in the Fair Employment Practices Act that gives the Attorney General and state's attorneys jurisdiction there. The language that goes on here, providing the same rights and remedies for someone who's accused of wrongdoing, and then allowing the superior courts to impose the same civil penalties and investigation costs and to order other relief to the state and individuals who are harmed by discrimination, also tracks with the Fair Employment Practices Act. So what we've done is take what we already have for employment discrimination and bring it into fair housing and public accommodations, to the extent that the state's attorneys or the Attorney General gets involved in the enforcement here.
So currently the AG doesn't have this enforcement right. So what we're really adding enforcement to help the resources of the Human Rights Commission, which is under-resourced. Sadly, Attorney Generals and state's attorneys are under-resourced also. So,
right. So,
which is one of the challenges. Do we have an appropriation with this?
I don't believe there's one in the bill currently, but I think if the committee decides to move forward with this language or to consider moving forward, probably your next conversation is with our new Attorney General to
and the
ask
Office
her
of State's Attorneys
and the Office of
Sheriffs.
State's Attorneys and Sheriffs
So,
to ask them if they have the resources and if they see potential issues with this expansion. And likewise, the Human Rights Commission to see if they have concerns about this potential ability to refer and the sharing authority.
And not that this is satisfactory, but we do have legally coming this week, who could at least speak to when they have a fair housing program that they can at least speak to when they feel like this has abruptly ended or been delayed because there's no place.
oh, that I'm sure that the need can be articulated and illustrated. It's when we just all have to be careful when we add resources to one group and add more responsibilities to another. We have to enable the other group to be able to actually do the work.
And I want to make sure I understand where this all came from,
So this was,
who's gonna be defending this fully.
this is language that was requested by the working group.
Okay,
I don't know
right.
specifically who proposed it, but
okay.
it came out of those discussions
Okay.
in the fall.
So Representative Baumgart's could
Yeah, he could point
be
you
the
towards
first. Yeah. And
yeah.
we have us who's on the Davis to come in as well, who has been part of the discussion, so.
Yeah, so I would defer to them on the need that they saw. One additional change in here from the Fair Employment Practices Act, though, on the top of page 27, lines 1 and 2, is the cross-reference to the criminal penalty for violations of the Fair Housing and Public Accommodations Act, which we'll get to next. So the next section, section 21, amends that section 9 VSA 4507 to increase the criminal penalty from $1,000 to $10,000 per violation. So there are two important things there. One, the penalty is going up by $9,000. Two, it's changing from a criminal penalty or fine of not more than $1,000 period to $10,000 per violation. So this could become a significant penalty for someone who engages in widespread discrimination. Of course, it's not more, so the court has discretion to tailor that penalty as it sees fit, if it even decides to impose it. So, and that is it for, oh, no. I have
Building
Oh,
building
I
safety.
hope
safety.
you're doing building safety,
Tried-
because I don't know who is.
Tried to
Okay.
get out of that. No. Sorry, I forgot. That's it for fair housing and public accommodations. Are there questions about those sections?
No, I just think we have
Mhm.
identified the people we need to hear from.
Yeah, there's clearly some significant policy questions. Section 22 is a report from the Division of Fire Safety. It would require a report on or before next January 15th from the Executive Director of the Division of Fire Safety. And going on to page 28, it would identify and examine provisions from other jurisdictions' fire and life safety codes for residential buildings that would facilitate in Vermont the increased construction of new residential units, the conversion of existing space into new residential units, or both. And importantly, could be incorporated into the Vermont Fire and Building Safety Code. So what this is trying to get at is whether there are code provisions in other jurisdictions that could make it easier to construct or convert residential units. So convert existing building stock into residential units or construct new residential units. That could be incorporated into the Vermont Fire and Building Safety Code. It would give the Executive Director of the Division of Fire Safety the ability to pick and choose provisions they think would protect fire and life safety, but also potentially allow for improved ease in the conversion or construction of new units. It would include recommendations for legislative action necessary to enable any of the identified provisions to be incorporated into Vermont's Fire and Building Safety Code. And right now, the wording is fairly broad around the Division of Fire Safety's authority. But as far as adopting the code goes, and if you look at our fire and building safety codes, the rules adopted around them include a number of amendments to the national code to make it fit Vermont's needs. And so this is asking whether there are other amendments that could be made. But you'll probably want to hear from the Division of Fire Safety and other advocates around housing on considerations with this potential study and whether the language needs to be tweaked. Any questions?
Just a quick question. So can other jurisdictions be smaller, like towns? Could it be other states?
Yeah,
It is the
it could
federal.
be other states, other countries, it could be Canadian provinces, it could be cities.
And it could be towns within Vermont if they have
So
any.
towns within Vermont are required to have the Vermont code as sort of their base.
So there wouldn't be anything applicable.
So most likely you're not going to find much in municipalities and towns in Vermont that they would be able to apply statewide, but there's a chance. Maybe there's something that's been approved. So I don't know the details of the code. So that would be potentially a better question for the Executive Director of the division. But certainly this would allow the Executive Director to say, and this is absolutely a hypothetical, that say Quebec has a really, a new approach to addressing means of egress, which they've seen bring down the cost of new construction, and it's potentially as safe or safer than our required egress. Maybe we could incorporate that here and they could start doing that consideration of whether that sort of thing makes sense for Vermont, given the differences between us and Quebec and so forth. So there are a lot of considerations that will come into saying whether a code provision in another jurisdiction would work in Vermont because of the differences in our building stock, our firefighting capabilities, and even just in the basic construction style and technologies that we use. But I'm not an expert on those things by any stretch of the imagination. So I would definitely defer to the fire and building safety experts and the folks who are doing housing construction.
And we'll have them in, Senator Clarkson, and then we're gonna get Becky in.
Because the other piece we need an update on is how the transition from the town health officers to the fire and safety inspection statewide, how that's going. We need an update on that and see how that's rolling out. And because that's one of the other things we did, is that we added the ability for towns to access fire and safety health inspectors statewide.
Great,
Because there are 6 towns, you know, that have their own inspection.
right,
Well,
maybe
and
even a
all
couple
of
more
town
now.
health officers, many of whom are not wanting to do the work they're now required to do. So we need
Great.
an
Thank
update on
you
that.
so much,
Great.
Damien.
Thank you for your
Nice and
time.
smooth. So, yeah,
And yeah, that was speedy.
so I don't,
Oh,
yeah, I would say for the next section with Becky, in the witness chair, or, we have, I made an executive decision, I will say, to take anything TIF related and put it in here because I didn't think we would have time to send finance a separate TIF bill, but now we have 3 people on finance in this committee. So I wanted to spend the next 15 minutes just talking about very high level what TIF sections are in this bill, and then having an open discussion on whether or not how we flow TIFs that may not be in this bill. If that makes sense.
Okay, Becky Wasserman, Legislative Counsel. I think everyone is familiar with TIFs, but I didn't know if you wanted me to go over very broadly.
I'm broad familiar.
Okay.
Are you?
Generally, they're different in Vermont, but, I mean, I'm familiar with the Winooski one, but.
Yeah, well, I think
But
that-
they're different from each other.
Right, but the new ones, then we're going into these project-based
Yeah.
TIFs, which is
Yeah.
small. Like,
Right,
it would, yeah.
yeah. Let's
Um,
do what you want to do.
okay,
If I have questions, I'll ask them
so-
later.
Okay,
Because Winooski is different. Winooski, Burlington, and Georgia all, and then finance did a statewide standard. So other than those, I
Okay.
think there's 5.
Okay,
The early
That's helpful.
They're all the same.
okay.
yeah, so just very generally speaking, it is an economic development tool that helps where a municipality can borrow funds for public infrastructure. And then the idea is that will bring in private investment and increase property tax revenues.
And I will just also preface by saying it became a bigger issue today, given what the headlines look like for Burlington. So that is
Okay,
another reason.
My paper was in the driveway and
Okay.
it won't have the headlines for 3 days.
Yeah, well, I don't want to take us down a rabbit hole,
Okay.
but the auditor has dinged Burlington for a number of mistakes that are expensive.
Yes.
And Burlington is not denying at least some of them. So we may have to look at TIFs as a bigger issue than just, oh, these are a couple issues we've dealt with in the past.
We tried to get a change to the inspection schedule, and the auditor and the treasurer from Burlington couldn't work it out.
Yeah.
It was quite frustrating.
Right, so we may not have time for that. Yes, not here. Thanks.
Okay. So, there is the existing TIF district program that I think everyone is familiar with, where there are the districts in certain municipalities. But what is in this bill is setting up what has been called the mini TIFs, the project-based TIFs. And so, and I wanted to give this overview because a lot of the language is essentially using the framework for TIF districts to set up how the project-based TIFs will work, but they're sort of on they're on a smaller scale. And so this project-based TIF language, I think, started 3 or 4 years ago, and has never passed. And the version in this bill is slightly different than I think what everyone has seen before. So I can walk through the language, I can sort of note where it is different from where it was before.
Yeah.
Okay, I just. I
And,
wanna-
and just in the highest level overview, I want to make sure I remember, so far, is this project-based TIFs, and there's the 2 TIF extensions requested
Yeah.
from Berry City and Hartford, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And that completes the TIF section.
Yeah, so there are only
So-
3, so there's the
Right.
project-based TIFs, and then there are the extensions for 2 of the active TIF districts.
Okay, great.
So I can run through the project-based TIF language. Sorry, I'll go back to the Berry TIF. I think I just received today what the extension was for that. So right now, the language in the bill is a placeholder, so I can fill that out in the next draft.
And those are all being introduced as separate bills too.
Okay, that's how they use.
Oh, yeah, you can't, she can't confirm or deny that, but that, wait, okay.
I'm
That is
just saying,
helpful
as a
context,
sponsor of one of them, they're being introduced as separate bills.
yeah, right, you know that both are.
I know that Hartford.
Okay, well, that's. you
I
don't
would
have-
assume one of the Barry reps probably.
Yeah.
Introducing.
So it's being introduced in the House and the Senate. So
Okay.
I don't know who starts on TIF extensions.
Nobody's talked to me, but they come to me.
That could be my fault, because I went to VLCT and said, could you tell me who is requesting a TIF extension? So-
Yeah, I've not known VLCT to be involved in the process before.
Hmm.
I am saying to you, a Hartford TIF extension's coming to you also. and it's-
Okay.
Okay, so.
Okay.
just to be sure. Yeah,
And it's all. Okay.
So the project-based TIF language starts on page 28 of the bill. And the subsection A has all the definitions that apply to the project-based TIFs. And I will first note just the title of the section that is different is that in previous years when this was introduced, it was a pilot program, but this is not being introduced as a pilot program. And then, and I can go into greater detail if you want, but I'm gonna note where some of the definitions, there are changes. So the definition of financing for TIF districts is basically saying the debt that a municipality incurs that they can use to pay for the improvements in the for the project. And in previous years, there was language included on the use of bond anticipation notes. And so that was taken out in this version. And that was included with respect to when the debt would be counted as being incurred for the purpose of the project being created and the ability to retain increment, like the clock starts running on that.
So bond anticipation notes can still be used, it's just they're not in this. And
My understanding is yes, there was specific language in previous years on trying to clarify when the use of bond anticipation notes counted towards the first incurrence of debt.
okay,
And
When
I think
the
because
clock
this is,
starts
yeah.
running.
Okay,
So this is,
okay.
these projects are shorter time periods for like the debt incurrence than a district. So I think maybe that was left out because of the way these are structured, but this language came from the ACCD, so they could probably speak to why they took it out.
Okay. Shorter time periods, less money. Smaller projects. Designed for smaller towns. to be able to
impacts
access,
the ed fund.
Right,
There is the tension.
yeah.
only for 20 years, or actually now with,
And there is, I will not allow the discussion in my committee because it is a religiously held conviction that you do not overturn with logic or data. Whether or not those projects would have been built, whether or not we did a TIF district. Would the Hampton Inn have gone in and paid money into the ed fund somewhere in the state rather than in downtown Burlington where not Burlington, St. Albans, where the money doesn't get paid into the ed fund for 20 years or all of it does.
Yeah,
I
no,
like.
you don't talk
TIFs.
about that anymore.
No, there's no logic. There are a couple things in this building, like whether or not rich people will move in or out of the state, no matter how much you tax them, that data doesn't matter. You either believe it or you don't.
some of us love
Okay.
TIFs,
I see.
some of us hate TIFs.
Okay,
Some of us love TIFs, but vote against many TIFs. I am the queen of
Okay.
TIFs.
good to know.
Yeah, it's good. We want to have
It's
something of a
conflicted.
discussion about whether or not this will
Well,
be
I-
a discussion we should know.
Yeah. I'm thinking we may be moving out of the need for big TIFs because they really are only suited to larger municipalities that really do have a finance, a planning, a zoning department. And maybe if we did away with big TIFs and focused into the more smaller, and then is that the best way to finance those small projects? But that, I think, might
That's a
be
big
a
group,
good discussion.
but small towns came to us and said, can we do?
Oh,
Something
yeah, I'm
like
aware of
Well,
that, yeah. No, they're a pretty good source of
Yeah.
funding, yeah.
Okay, so moving on to page 29, the definition of improvements. So this is the sort of infrastructure that the municipality is doing with by incurring debt to pay for that infrastructure. In the previous version, there was language about the use of debt service payments, limiting it to 5 years that you could fund debt service payments. And that was removed and included here is in the definition of improvements. It says that this also means the funding of debt service interest payments. So it's sort of making a policy decision that the legislature has been wrestling with the last few years about whether those are included in what can be paid for out of what can it be, the debt can be incurred to pay for debt service payments. Okay. There, in the previous version was a definition of a nexus requirement. The definition was removed, but later on in the language, there's a determination that Betsy has to make to say that there's a nexus between the improvement and the expected development and outcomes. So that's sort of still in here, just not in the definition section. The definition of project on page, beginning on page 30. This is what can be, what do we mean by a TIF project? There have been various versions. I think the last time this came out of Senate Finance, there was a monetary cap on the amount of a project. So that was removed. So there's no cap on this, the size of the project in terms of a threshold. And then some of the criteria was change. So this has that a project must meet one of the following 4 criteria. And, these line up mostly with what the TIF district criteria are. So on page 31, under subsection B, again, there was language removed to this being a pilot program. Previous versions had a limit on the amount of projects that could be approved during the term of the pilot program. This has no limit to the number of projects, but does say there's not more than 1 per municipality.
Did we vote that out last year and it died in the ropes?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I think it did, because there was also S33, which was the TIF district bill that didn't get out of finance. But I think the mini TIF bill
Made it, and the limitation, there is some concern that small towns who have 3 to 5 select board members who may or may not know anything about finance or development, a clerk treasurer who may or may not know anything, and no town manager, no that you could easily get yourself in over your head, especially if you've got a developer selling you a bill of goods. And that's, other than the impact on the ed fund, one of the concerns that surfaced in finance.
Thank you.
So we have hit noon, and I think it was valuable to start talking about, there are some changes that if we discuss project-based TIFs again, would be, nuanced changes to this bill. I don't think that discussions we haven't seen before. We don't have Senator Brock here today, he's not feeling well, but I think there is a bigger question, and I'm looking at Senator Cummings about if you want to see project-based TIFs come from this committee or see it in a separate bill that goes directly to your committee with other TIF requests. Or you want our informal input?
Yeah, I don't care how it comes
Okay.
to us. The question is, do you want the rest of your bill coming to us? Because I've got enough new members.
Yeah,
Don't
right.
know how it's gonna shift out. I think that the extensions need to come to us as separate bills. Those were the last resort. And
Yeah.
I believe it should be a formal application, not
right,
buried in an economic development bill.
right. So does anyone currently here have strong feelings about project-based TIFs in general, or us giving informal input versus sending a bill over? So maybe we introduce a separate bill on this topic, and we'll definitely.
So that we don't send the whole housing. Are there
Yeah.
other areas? Because the other pieces would go to approach, but not necessarily to finance.
Right.
No.
And planning and zoning changes.
You don't have to take it.
They may go to GovOps.
I mean, I think we're giving other committees
Yeah,
passing, just, this will, and natural resources, they will probably have a day long, kind of discussion.
oh, at least.
Yes. Well, we would come in, and
Yeah.
give them a chance to think about it. But unless someone has strong feelings, we'll certainly strike the extensions. And for now,
We could do it separately.
we'll request a separate project-based TIF bill. If anybody would like to be on it, I don't know, Senator.
I'd love to be on it.
Expressing interest in moving in that direction. you know, but you don't have to be.
I happen to be a fan, and I think we're gonna hear ACTV's some
Right.
ideas on how to simplify.
Yes, and VLCT will be coming in and talking about how important this is to them. So that, I wanted to have that discussion while we were online, so that this didn't just disappear without conversation, but I think we're done in committee, and that's the path that we'll take on
Okay.
tips.
Great.
Thank you, Becky.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Okay,